Hey everybody, it's Alex, still driving to work. This is one of those mid-car ride episodes here. And I have a topic that I've thought about for quite some time that I think is interesting. And let me lay out my thesis for you here. So I think one of the single best ways to understand American, well, I guess Western, yeah, we'll say Western pop culture over the past, let's say, 60, 70 years is to look at two of pop culture's biggest, most long-lasting characters, and that would be Superman and James Bond. Yes, it's another Superman episode. It's always a Superman episode with me. And so Superman and James Bond, these are very interesting. You've got some very interesting dynamics going on here. These are characters that have been almost continuously appearing from at least the late 50s with James Bond. I think the first novel Casino Royale is like maybe 57 or something. And the films start in like the early 60s, if I recall. I think that's when, or at least the Eon films. So Doctor No is like 61 or something, or it's around that. It's around late 50s, around 60s, and Superman obviously 1938 till now. And Superman, he's been published continuously in Action Comics magazine and Superman comics since the 30s, and has made numbers of appearances in cartoons, shows, live action, movies, this and that. And James Bond, the same, but I think the main vessel main format we now really know the character from is the films, as opposed to the original novel source material. That's kind of fallen by the wayside because it hasn't continued in the same way, I think, as like Superman has in his original format. So these characters, if you line them up, they've gone through a number of different reinventions, reiterations, all these like tone shifts and stuff, like different versions of like what kind of stories that they tell with them. And if you look, it's actually very, very similar in terms of like the trajectory of these two characters and how they kind of have evolved and changed over this span of time. So if you look at we'll start with we'll go back to like the origins of these two characters. So these characters are coming out of like this sort of like very early 20th or early mid 20th century, World War I, World War II era stuff. James Bond, he's like initially this very very mercenary character. He's got this like kind of this view of the world where he's this perfectionist on everything, or this not perfectionist, but he's like a connoisseur of all these like little things in life, in like the very original novel, because he doesn't know his own life expectancy is so bad for for someone in his line of work. Oh, we've got an accident up here. That would explain the slowdown. It doesn't look too bad, in case you're wondering. Yeah, it looks like everybody was able to walk away. But he's this sort of like mercenary gunsman who is slowly coming out of his, this sort of like, very dark point of view in the original novel as he, falls in love, falls for Vesper Lynd. And then once that's sort of yanked away from him toward the end of the story, he goes and he's sort of concretized into this very firm character that you see going forward in many of the original novels, all of which are, I think, maybe except for the very last one, are before the Eon films. So the last one is, I think, The Living Daylights. That sounds right. Octopussy and The Living Daylights is maybe the very last one. And if you look at early Superman, he's also this, very different character from how you kind of think of him now, where he is more this like, a crusader. He's going around dealing with a lot like lower, more grounded types of foes. criminals, corruption, all this and that. And it's only after some time that you start to see more of the science fiction elements that are part of his origin and power set creep their way into the rest of the stories. Where Superman starts fighting mad scientists and giant robot dinosaurs and all sorts of stuff, right? It's it's very it slowly gets away from that original. But Superman, I think he was more originally formulated as a serial character. So his first couple of appearances, they don't have that sort of defining character moment. Outside of like his backstory that like Bond has in his first outing. But that's kind of like that's where the characters start out as more gritty and grounded, with these like little tiny character pieces that kind of play into who they are. And as you march forward, we get to the Sean Connery Bond. It's a little bit different. We're in the 60s now. Things are a little bit more. How shall we say? They're you get like a little bit more whimsical. Where we've crept very far away from like the World War II setting of things, and now we're firmly in the Cold War. So there's Bond is just all Cold War intrigue all the time, basically through the Pierce Brosnan films. And as Superman, he is now dealing with a lot more. By the 60s, a lot more of these sci-fi extraterrestrial threats and fantastic situations with kryptonite and the ever-expanding cast of the super family, right? So in the 60s, you see sort of this reinvention of these characters to this more fantastical version, and as you go from Sean Connery to briefly George Lazenby and then Roger Moore, you see things go radically more in that direction, and same with Superman. But then you have and that we'll call that like the silver ages of these characters. And then by the 70s for Superman, or the end of the tail end of the Roger Moore films into like the Timothy Dalton films. For Bond, you have like their Bronze Age, where there's another reinvention of from peak wackiness and goofiness of the 60s to a more grim and gritty version of things, where characters are depowered. They have parts of their identity taken away from them. Like in License to Kill, where Bond loses his license to kill, and he goes around acting like super pissed off at everything the whole movie. It's a very, very similar development where things kind of have grown up. You've gotten past, in I think American society at least, you have this real transformation of culture from like the atomic era to the post like Kennedy assassination, where there's this like somber element to culture. I don't know if you can still hear me very well because the rain is now very bad. But bear with me. Hopefully, whatever audio post-processing I do, you can still hear me. But you have this, like again, very much reinvention towards something more grounded and realistic. And even for Superman, you get this with the Superman's breaks loose storyline with Denny O'Neil and Neil Adams / Kurt Swan, and that all culminates into like their darkest moment of the original runs here, and then there's and that kind of like goes in through the 80s a bit, and 80s obviously is a big decade for Superman, where there's this reinvention by with the John Byrne Man of Steel reboot, totally away from like the original continuity of the character and all the more fantastical elements of it, to a more serialized Marvel style thing with more emphasized human supporting cast. And again, like James Bond is like firmly in the weeds of like has seen the end of the Roger Moore era that is gotten like a little bit darker and grittier, but still has some wacky elements to Timothy Dalton, where it's just like peak like dark Bond up to that point, and then Bond kind of like goes away for a couple of years. Bond was coming out. They're coming out with like a new Eon Bond movie every 2 years basically, and that stops with License to Kill, and I think there's some like contract problems in there. My Bond film knowledge is a little rusty at the moment, because at some point Timothy Dalton was supposed to be Bond like way back in the 70s, I think, but he was like too young. And then Pierce Brosnan was also supposed to be Bond much earlier, but then they brought Dalton back in because he had a scheduling conflict or something. But anyway, you have all that. You also have Never Say Never Again during that time period with old Sean Connery reprising his role, and it's kind of matches up, funnily enough, with the big moment, that big Bond or the big Superman story of that time period in The Dark Knight Returns. Really it's a Batman story, but like in that mid 80s where we explore this older version of like what if these pop culture characters were allowed to live on and grow older, and where would they be in like in the Reagan Thatcher era, and how they've kind of like transformed, and with Superman, Batman, you got this like definitive awesome take on the characters that has totally changed how you look at like at least the Superman Batman dynamic, and the superhero medium as a whole. And Never Say Never Again, you got a really bad movie, but still kind of exploring the same sort of idea, right? And that all kind of like goes through. In the 90s, you maybe have you have sort of like another reinvention where things start to focus more wholly on action and spectacle, where film has kind of like come a long way into like commercial big budget action movies with all these like great effects and all this stuff. You have, and GoldenEye, I think, is like sort of, it's like a soft reboot to the James Bond franchise. Is the first 90s outing, and that it goes back and blends elements of like the Dalton and the Moore and the Connery films, and I think for me that's probably like the definitive film James Bond of combining all of those elements. And Superman, you have obviously probably the most famous or infamous Superman story of all time in The Death of Superman, where it just turns into all action all the time, and it is the real. It's where you see a lot of like the extreme '90s come in to comics and leave their mark on that character, where things move a lot in that direction, and you find they found something that worked with The Death of Superman, and they just kind of like mine that format to death, and until the character kind of couldn't take it anymore. And then the same thing in Bond too, where the Pierce Brosnan follow-up movies are just like clearly not as lacking in some of those ideas, and then by the time you get to Die Another Day, it feels tired, and ready for another reinvention, right? And things change in culture radically again. We look at like 9/11 is probably the definitive moment of that. Again, as an American, looking at all this through the American lens, that's a definitive moment of the early 2000s cultural landscape, and shapes things up till maybe like 2008, where you have this sort of like now. You kind of like got tired, and you have like now so much distance away from the original event, where people are not as bought into or interested in continuing on with like the mission, right? And you have like maybe this like deconstruction of like what was going on in like the government and military industrial complex, and focus on like what was wrong with these core things, right? And like you see that in the way that Bond and Superman are treated during this time. Like Bond in the Daniel Craig era is all deconstructing the character. And supposedly there's some of that came from like just how successful the Austin Powers films were and how much they kind of lampooned and made mockery of like those original Bond sort of elements. But you see it like this is like in the 2000s to mid 2000s to like 2010s. Superman echoes that same thing where you have like all these much darker stories like from like Superman for what is it called? Our World's at War is a 9/11 story before 9/11, like right before 9/11 happened. And then they kind of have to run with it. And, you get like stories like Superman for Tomorrow. It's just like this really dark, kind of like, horrible, not horrible, but like really, really like depressing story. Going into like Infinite Crisis where they make this big deal of like the darkness of where pop culture, where these superheroes have gone, versus maybe like trying to bring back some of that light, and it just like continues through those 2010s where like you have like that new 52 Superman through like 2015 till about Rebirth is still like kind of like lost its way, and has been unable to kind of embrace that original or that like most famous version of the character. And Bond too, you have like Casino Royale. I think the Casino Royale Daniel Craig film is probably the greatest Bond movie of all time, at least top three, up there with GoldenEye and like Goldfinger. It's a fan. And Skyfall too is quite good, and like that is like peak like dark Bond, and going in and treating it like as that modern action spy thriller that is worked, and bringing it to that sort of that original character, that original version of it. But like at some point things went too far, and they got so far in deconstructing Bond that they killed him off. they killed him off, and maybe lost a lot of what what drew a lot of like popular audiences back in the 60s and the 90s to those characters, and to that world, and now it's just kind of been lost in limbo. And so and I think that is also in the like late 2010s to like the early 2020s, you just have a lot of that culture deconstruction, and that's just been that has kind of existed and been with us. And Bond has been unable to sort of come out of it so far. They've been unable to move forward or get any traction, it seems, with the new project. But Superman, thankfully, I think is actually in a lot better place than he's been in maybe for the past 15 years, where we've had two back-to-back fantastic Superman runs with Josh Williamson and Philip Kennedy Johnson have been really great, and have been able to marry a lot of the core elements of like what has stuck around and made that character really interesting. Bring us a lot of like new stories while mining through and not just choosing like the greatest hits of Superman, but coming in and bringing back elements of all these like less remembered but still important, interesting parts of the Superman mythos over time. And that's like that's my rambling little history lesson there. I think like it's very interesting to track these characters, because they are some of the only ones that have lived and been around through all of that time. If you think of other incredibly influential media franchises that have kind of like been around, like like a Star Wars, Indiana Jones, even like The Matrix, these things have kind of come and gone, and they are very great windows into maybe what was going on in those individual points in time when they were released. Like The Matrix, I think, is probably the most influential piece of media from like that late 90s, early 2000s, like Y2K era of like that just it really encapsulated everything about how people were feeling about about computers and like office culture back then, and turned it into this great mythological story. But it was unable to kind of continue on successfully from there, and obviously it's been mostly dormant, aside from like that brief blip where Matrix 4 came out, and I don't know, didn't really leave a mark. So I hope that was interesting to you. This is just like, as a lover of especially comics, but also a lot of these sort of like pulp fiction sort of characters, like Bond and Conan. It's really interesting to trace back through time and see how culture has influenced pop culture and the other way around in how like the world kind of looks. And there you go. That's my rant. That's it there for you. I hope that gave you something interesting to think about. If you and we're my YouTuber chops are now improving, it seems. But if you think of another character that kind of fits this mold, or some other sort of like pop culture sort of thing that you can trace through a similar time that has gone on for that long and had all these different iterations, leave that in the comments. Leave that in the comments, you viewer. And comment and subscribe, or whatever it is you're supposed to do. I really need to go at some point figure out how to do this thing right, this YouTube thing. But whatever. This is my minimal effort car entertainment for myself anyway, so it doesn't matter that much. So thank you so much for watching, for listening. I hope you have a wonderful day. Go forth, 007, and seize the day. All right, goodbye.